From Zivic's incredible ability to gladly go for low blows to Mike Tyson's strange ear-biting moment, these are some of the dirtiest fighters in boxing history, starting with Fritzy Zivic. Now, some people would make the case that he was the dirtiest fighter of all time. Interestingly enough, that wasn't a title that Zivic had a problem with. The man knew what he was doing. And when you're that good at it, you want the credit too. Fritzy did it all, from thumbing the eyes to headbutting. He'd even stoop to dragging the heel of the glove over his opponent's open cut. Yikes! Even the fans and the media would be against Zivic's blatant foul play display. Once, after his foul fest with Henry Armstrong, who was getting on in years, Fritzy took away Armstrong's welterweight title, but the crowd could be heard jeering and booing the winner. Fritzy, on the other hand, couldn't have been more unbothered by it all. Armstrong was taken back to the dressing room in a horrible state, though. His eyes were swollen shut and had gashes that tore through both eyelids. Zivic's manager, Freddie Fierro, once famously said that Fritzy could enter a clinch with a clean opponent, but when the referee would break them apart, the opponent would be all broken up with streams of blood on their faces. That was the kind of damage that Fritzy could manage without even landing a single punch. Also, he could take as well as he gave. That was obvious from his own face. It seemed as though he'd been torn apart and quickly stitched right back up. Now, the same can be said about this next guy, Antonio Margarito, who could totally be considered Zivic's more modern counterpart. Antonio crossed a big red line in the world of boxing. He was caught loading up his gloves. In an already dangerous sport, this acts as another level of distress because it's an offense that can lead to arrest. Although it did give Margarito a unique place in the history of boxing, he's the only fighter with a world title who got caught doing it. His defense? He said that he had no idea about it at all, and that his trainer, Javier Capetillo, had put in a tempered pad right before his fight against Shane Mosley. It's theoretically possible, but I don't buy it. Because one, the sort of damage he gave Miguel Cotto could only be explained by loaded gloves, and no one could really explain the damage to Antonio's hand wraps. But it could have been caused by something hard being inside of them. And two, Margarito kinda lost his edge after being caught. His trademark brutal punching never surfaced again. He couldn't seriously hurt, let alone disfigure an opponent. Now, how is such a thing possible? It really makes you think. Next up is a fighter who would not be happy to be put on this list, Sandy Sadler. Sandy would never accept the label of being a dirty fighter. He was always pretty insistent that such accusations against him were unfair, which was kind of odd because, well, you could see it in the fights. Now, let's give credit where it's due. Sandy did follow boxing rules for the most part, but that totally flipped once his opponent went against the rulebook. Then, all bets were off. Though, here's a little snag. Sandy would go totally ballistic even if he thought his opponent had crossed a line. That didn't always mean that the dirty fighting was justified, but boy did it happen. Sadler was an expert when it came to elbowing, heeling, gouging, butting, or lacing the eyes. He also had no hesitation in grabbing the opponent into a headlock and throwing him down onto the floor. Also, Sandy was successful against Willie Pep, who was one of the smartest and most skilled defensive fighters. How do you think he did it? Well, Sandy's aggressiveness and all that usually followed certainly helped. The clash remains one of the filthiest bouts in the sport's history. Now, this next fighter was an expert at blurring the lines between being skilled and being dirty, Bernard Hopkins. Now, above anything, Hopkins was crafty. Even when fighting dirty, the guy had his wits about him. This is the reason why he would never get called out on it. He was so next level that he made dirty techniques a part of his fighting style. And, according to him, the fact that he got away with it all showed the major mental edge he had over his opponents. He's never lost a fight due to a disqualification, even though his ring antics were enough to raise alarms. This ageless fighter really made it all work for him. Once, when interviewed about how he fought dirty, the executioner had a pretty arrogant response. He said that being able to pull a fast one right before the referee was a skill, and it was the mark of a fighter who put in their training hours. Some of his classy moves included landing extra punches past the bell, holding and hitting the back of the head. Bernard was never clumsy about it. he went in for low blows quite steadily. Speaking of fighters who could fool everyone, let's also talk about Harry Greb. Harry turned biting into a technique when it came to fighting. Just like Zivik, Greb's hands were deadly, but he had plenty more in his arsenal. He also used knees, elbows, backhands, and the old cruel glove laces drag across the face. A New York paper once said that Harry had 2 energetic hands that flew around, but the top of the fighter's head was his most menacing weapon. They also added that if the rules of boxing were enforced properly, Greb would hardly be able to make it past the first round. What gave Harry an additional edge was that he didn't only fight in the ring, he also enjoyed fighting in the streets. When he was the middleweight champion, Greb challenged Gene Tunney for the American light heavyweight title. And boy, did Tunney get a class on street fighting. Harry slammed his head right into Tunney's face and broke his nose. Next, he held Tunney from behind the head with one hand while blasting him with full force using his other hand. The fact that Tunney made it all the way to round 15 was remarkable, but he was in pretty bad shape once the fight was finished. Gene had cuts right above both his eyes, and blood was streaming from his mouth and nose. Talk about a dirty fight. And if you think this guy was brutal, let me tell you about Ad Wolgast. Now, Ad liked going straight for the jugular, but I'm talking about the one down south, if you catch my drift. The Michigan Wildcat just couldn't resist going for his opponent's nether regions. With this guy, they might as well have had a target painted over them. Wolgast was disqualified at least 4 times, and one of these cost him his world lightweight title. Plus, this sort of move was so common for Wolgast that he practically became known for it. Some might say that's just one move, but there's no doubt it's enough to make him one of the dirtiest fighters in history. Of course, Wolgast isn't the only legend who totally went wild. This next one's got quite a rapport himself. Mike Tyson. Iron Mike may be the baddest man on the planet, and he was never exactly a dirty fighter because he just never had to be. But one time, Tyson committed one of the bloodiest fouls in the history of boxing. Look, it's simple. If you bite off a man's ear in the ring, you end up on a list of dirty fighters. And Kid Dynamite did exactly that when he went full beast on Evander Holyfield. And as insane as it sounds, Mike did it twice. After the first time, he drew a good amount of blood. But after the second attempt, Mike came away with a chunk of Holyfield's ear. Holyfield was in total chaos, and Tyson was still hungry for more. When it comes to playing foul, this move really takes the cake. With millions watching the pay-per-view bout, this moment has certainly gone down in history. So, from Mike Tyson's strange ear-biting moment to Zivik's incredible ability to gladly go for low blows, those were the dirtiest fighters in boxing history.